With that, we will move on to our next speaker, Jared Brooke, who is going to talk, I'm going to say in general, about now Phragmites and the issues that they may cause.
Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So I'm going to talk about Phragmites, but I'm also going to cover a few more in common wetland invasive plants that you may see kind of growing in the same area as you would Phragmites. So we're going to go with a trifecta of species, certainly cover Phragmites, but we'll get into other ones. So this is probably not new information to many people, but when we talk about invasives, we're talking about issues with them outcompeting and replacing native plants. And when we talk about wetland invasives, we're talking about the effects that they have on those wetland ecosystems, which are so important to the filtration of water, the collection of water, the providing habitat for abundance of wildlife species, plant diversity, all those different kind of things. And the way that invasives can impact wetlands is obviously by reducing plant diversity or reducing, changing, or eliminating habitat for certain wildlife species. But they can also change the wetland hydrology and natural functions. So they can cause issues with how the wetlands function as those filters of water and how much surface water is there and all that kind of thing. And then if we think about the aesthetics of a wetland and how wetlands are used, they can change the aesthetics or how wetlands look. They can change how you can see and view a wetland. And that can also change how you might recreate in or around wetlands, whether that's trying to watch wildlife, whether that's trying to hunt, fish, boat, all those kind of things. Wetland or invasive species in wetlands can cause those issues. And when we talk about the invasive species today, we're going to cover more of the terrestrial. We're covering just some terrestrial or invasives that are on the land, not necessarily invasives that are going to be kind of free floating in the water. So we're going to talk about some of the ones that you'll find on the shores, on the banks, and maybe even up a little bit farther. So like the first one we're going to talk about is common reed, which is often called Phragmites. So you'll hear people call it common reed, or you'll hear people call it by its genus, which is Phragmites. And it was originally introduced from Europe, potentially in the late 1700s, early 1800s, depending on what source you go with. It's a warm season perennial grass, meaning that it is growing and green during the summer, during the hottest months. And then it is actually dormant pretty much all the way from about now until about March or April. It's a pretty easy one to spot. It grows 10 to 15 feet tall in large, dense clumps. If you drive anywhere on I-65 up through Northwest Indiana onto the toll road or anywhere like that, you can easily spot clumps of Phragmites from the roadway and from your car going 70 miles an hour. You can easily spot them. They're pretty easy to tell apart. They're going to be flowering from July to August to October. So they're just now transitioning into the point where they've went dormant and they're now getting ready to spread or shed their seeds. One of the characteristics you can use to really tell Phragmites apart from other wetland plants, other than its just large size and dense clump, is its silky seed head, which we'll see a picture of here in a second. And it spreads by seeds blowing offside or falling in the water and being transported in other places. It spreads by rhizomes as well. So it's a rhizomatous plant and it can spread pretty quickly that way. And it can also be spread by moving soil off-site. And that can be soil that's, attached to equipment, soil that's attached to four-wheelers, ATVs, UTVs, trucks, anything like that. There's soil caked in there. It can be spread from the soils, the rhizomes, and the seed. And you typically find Phragmites obviously around water. It's going to be in wetlands. You see it all the time in ditches, roadsides, waterways, and then in really disturbed soils as well. So areas where soil has been moved and may have wetter soils, you're going to see Phragmites. And it is important to note out that there is a native subspecies of Phragmites that you will see. You don't see it very often. It can be kind of hard to tell apart from the invasive Phragmites, but it tends to be smaller, shorter in size with a few differences. So some of the key ways that you can tell Phragmites from other wetland plants is by its size and dense growth pattern. So you're not going to really find any other native wetland plants other than trees and shrubs that are going to be 10 to 15 to 20 feet tall. So it goes in this dense form, and this is what it looks like in the summer. Typically, you see most of the green on that upper half of the plant. And then in the winter, it's going to go dormant and dry down, and you're going to see these dead stems with that fluffy, silky seed head on top of it. So pretty easy to spot. There's a picture of that fluffy, silky seed head, and it tends to be drooping towards one side of the seed head or of the plant. So you typically see it on one side more than the other. And it has these kind of long tapering leaves on it. So they're going to be wider at the base and then tapering to a pretty sharp point. And then they typically come off the plant almost at like a 90-degree angle. So they go pretty straight. You can kind of see that in that picture there, them coming off at that 90-degree angle. And so like I said, there is also a native subspecies of Phragmites that you won't see nearly as much. It's very uncommon, but it's important to note that out in case you're looking to control the invasive one to be able to tell it apart. And so I pulled this information straight from this publication here, and I'll after I get done talking, I'll drop the link for this publication into the chat box so you can find it yourself. But this is from University of Minnesota, and it's just a guide to identifying the native and non-native Phragmites. Just some quick points on it. One of the points is that the native variety or native subspecies tends to have a thinner, smaller seed head. It's smaller in size, getting up to 5 or 6 feet rather than 10 to 15 feet. And the non-native seed head tends to be a lot denser and thicker. You can see that here as well. And then there's some slight differences in the leaf shape and then the stems and things like that. So I won't go over all that in this presentation, but if you're interested in really diving deep into how to tell apart the native and non-native Phragmites, this publication here has really good pictures and descriptions on how to do that. So just give you a brief glimpse into the life history and life cycle of Phragmites. From about now, that November timeframe all the way through March and April, it's going to be dormant. So you're going to see those standing dead stems with little to no green vegetation on them at all. And then in that April-May timeframe, you're going to start to see things green up. It's going to be vegetation without a seed head from May all the way to some point in July. And then in July through October, you're going to start to see the seed head form and then the seed mature and ripen. And then back to this time of year, it's going to be dormant again, and it's going to be shedding those seeds that it produced. So what impact does it have? Well, of course, it forms dense monocultures. Monocultures that can be acres and acres and acres in size. And just to kind of show you this picture here within that green outline is actually a creek that I worked on when I was working in Kentucky. And basically everything that you see inside of that green outline is Phragmites. If you were to go to that site, it's basically Phragmites as far as the eye can see. The only place there's not Phragmites is these little open patches of water here. And then the only reason that there's open patches of water there is because we work to control the Phragmites in that site. So this is a kind of a shallow creek, and it has basically spread across this whole creek kind of basin here. And it's essentially impenetrable even from a boat or things like that. So we actually had to apply herbicide from a helicopter to be able to control and get in there and access some of those sites. So of course, by outcompeting native plants, it reduces native plants, which are important for cover and food resources for wildlife. It reduces overall wildlife habitat. And so there are some species of wildlife that will use Phragmites. It's very common to see red-winged blackbird nests in Phragmites. But that's not to say it's good for wildlife. Red-winged blackbirds will nest about anywhere. So they're not real picky on what they want. You will find some shorebirds and other things like that that may use it, but overall it reduces the habitat quality for a lot of different wildlife species. From an aesthetic standpoint, if you live around a lake or a pond or a wetland, it has the potential to block your view of the water, so you won't be able to see into the wetland because of its size. And of course, it can block your access for boat traffic, for fishing, for hunting, or even swimming in some of these wetlands. It can also cause what they call drying of the wetland. So as it spreads across the wetland, it sheds that material, and it can actually cause sedimentation and stop the flowing of water, and it will essentially dry out the wetland through other processes like evaporation or evapotranspiration and things like that. So it can take a normal functioning wetland and turn it into almost completely dry wetland. So here's just a picture of a site that is basically Phragmites as far as you can see until that back tree line. So this is not an uncommon sight to see. This isn't from Indiana, but it's not an uncommon sight to see, especially in the northwest part of the state. So when we think about controlling Phragmites, some of the options we have are going to be either mechanical or chemical. You can mow it and you can cut it with a weed eater, or typically you have to use a brush cutter, which looks like a weed eater with a saw blade on the front of it because the stems are so thick. If that's the option that you choose, you're not going to eradicate it or really control it just with that method unless you do it multiple times over the growing season and multiple times over numerous years. But you can combine that with smothering, so putting black plastic tarp down over it, and that can control Phragmites. But if you just cut it, it's going to keep coming back from those rhizomes, from those roots. You can use prescribed fire, and that's a picture of us burning a field of Phragmites there. I will caution you that it is very flammable, as you can see from that picture, and that's one of the problems it has, is that if it gets into a wetland that's 30 acres of Phragmites, then it's going to be hard to control a fire that's in there. So it can be a fire hazard. But using a prescribed fire on Phragmites can be a really good way of getting rid of all of those dead stems so that it's easier to control later on. And you can use flooding as a way to control Phragmites, especially if you use it in conjunction with a chemical application. So you can treat the site with a chemical application to control it as much as you can. And then if you have the ability to flood the area, then you can flood it. The trick with the flooding is that it has to be completely submerged throughout the summer in order to control Phragmites. So it can't just be, it can't just have wet feet. It has to be completely covered by water, and it has to be during the growing season when it's actively growing. So the other option, and probably the best option, is with a chemical application. And I put an asterisk there next to chemical because, and the point was right up in the chat earlier, when you're using chemicals around waterways, you need to be careful, and you need to actually use herbicides that are labeled for use on or over water. And there's some different chemicals you can find that are actually labeled to use on water. So they have a little bit different formulation and different components to make them less impactful to the water and organisms that live in the water. So when you use a chemical on Phragmites, it's going to be a foliar application. So you're spraying the green growing part of Phragmites. That's typically going to be in that mid to late summer, from July to September, when it's actively growing. and before it's had a chance to really pull all those nutrients down to the root system. The trick is there, like Phil mentioned earlier, when you're in years of drought, those applications in that mid to late summer aren't as effective because those plants are under stress and they're not as able to pull those resources down the root system. The two chemicals that are best at controlling Phragmites are imazapyr and glyphosate. And actually the best way to control Phragmites can be with a combination of imazapyr and glyphosate. Now, again, you have to make sure that you're using the water labeled products of those chemicals. For imazapyr, one of the water labeled imazapyr products is called Habitat. For glyphosate, one of the products is called Rodeo. And here's just some information about the application rates and things you would use to control Phragmites. And so that table and then these management strategies here came from this publication, which is called A Guide to the Control and Management of Invasive Phragmites from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it kind of gives you a couple different options depending on if you have a very large, dense stand of Phragmites or if you have a low density stand. And that can be, starting with treating Phragmites in the early, mid to late summer, and then following that up with a prescribed fire or following up with a mowing. And then treating the re-sprouts or regrowth of Phragmites the next year. And the same thing on the low density stands. You're typically going to start maybe with a mowing or an herbicide application, come back and treat the site again with a mowing or herbicide or a fire to get rid of a lot of that dead material, and then come back and treat any resprouts you might have. So when it comes to identifying and looking for Phragmites, there's really not a whole lot that looks much like it, other than the native common reed, but you may find a couple plants in the wetlands that at first glance may look like could be Phragmites. The first ones are going to be woolgrass, and this is a picture of woolgrass here, and that's a native rush, and it tends to be a lot shorter, and then it has seed heads that droop over more rather than standing straight up like Phragmites. Cattails, we have native cattails. We also have potentially an invasive cattail. Those are going to be much shorter. They're always described as a hot dog on a stick, and you can see, or a corn dog on a stick, and you can see the seed head there. And the leaves tend to be down at the water level rather than up higher on the stem like the Phragmites. So the other one we're going to talk about, one of the other ones is reed canary grass. And so this is one that you commonly see growing in similar areas to Phragmites, but actually you can see reed canary grass kind of growing more outside of wet areas, maybe where you have muckier soils or wetter soils, but it's not actually maybe a true wetland. It grows 10 to 6 feet tall. It's a perennial cool season grass, meaning it's growing best basically this time of year, so October, November, and then through March, April, and May. And then it kind of goes dormant and doesn't grow as much in the summer when it's hotter out. It has a hollow stem. It has a rough, textured, sharp leaf, and I'll show you a picture of that here in a second. It's got a spike-like seed cluster or seed head, and then it's typical to find in floodplains, wetlands, stream banks, and anywhere with wet soils. And this is one that was commonly planted as a forage grass for cattle. And so here's an example of that sharp looking leaf. They tend to grow and almost grow up, and they tend to grow to a kind of a sharp point, and they're rough textured. And then here's a picture of the seed head when it's growing in that April, May timeframe before it opens up. And here's what it looks like after it opens up. It kind of gets a little more open and a little less spike-like. And then one way to tell it apart from some of the native species, native grasses that we may have in these areas, is by looking at this. This is called a ligule, and it has this kind of papery or membranous ligule around where the leaf meets the stem. So here's just a couple pictures of what it looks like when it's growing in its colonies. So this is a picture that what it would look like in that April, May, June timeframe, where it's green and growing and has the seed heads out. And then this picture down at the bottom is actually a picture that I just took 2 days ago of what it looks like in the winter. So you can pretty easily tell where it is in the winter based on the dead residual stems that you see. So from an impact standpoint, same thing as Phragmites, it forms a monoculture, which reduces plant diversity, you have reduced richness and abundance of insects, and it can change the wetland structure and actually change the soil makeup as far as soil nutrients. And then it can also increase sedimentation in wetlands by changing how water flows through the wetland, and then by shedding a lot of its dead material can cause sedimentation in wetlands. And so that picture over there on the right is this picture here, and that's a drone image of an area that is infested with reed canary grass. And basically, if you look in this area here, this is probably the best example of where reed canary grass is in that area, and it kind of encompasses that entire shot almost of that, where it's that light tan color and even into the green. This picture was taken in April, just as it's starting to really green up. And most of our native plants, which are warm season plants, are still dormant that time of year. So this is just a really good example of how heavily you can get reed canary grass. And this isn't really even a wetland. This is just an area that has wetter soils where it tends to do well. So from a control standpoint, if you're looking to control it mechanically, mowing can be a good option if you use it before herbicide, or mowing and then smothering with a black plastic tarp can also be another option. You can actually use prescribed fire in the late spring. So later April into May can be a good option to reduce reed canary grass, and then even flooding as well. So it likes wet soils, but it doesn't like to be covered completely with water. So if you have an impoundment or a wetland that you have the ability to add more water to, you can flood that area up to a certain depth and leave it there for the summer, and that will help control reed canary grass. You can also control it chemically, and the same thing goes as it does for Phragmites. If you're going to use it around water, you have to use a water-labeled herbicide. So the same herbicides that you could use for Phragmites, you could use to control reed canary grass, and those are best to be applied in the fall. This time of year right now is a really good time of year to apply it after we've had a couple of frosts, and then in the spring, in that March, April timeframe, when it starts to green up. Two of the chemicals that you can use are glyphosate and imazapyr. Those are the same ones you could use to control Phragmites. Imazapyr, or a combination of imazapyr and glyphosate, is going to give you better control. And there are a couple of grass selective herbicides, meaning that they're only going to kill grasses. They're not going to kill our wildflowers or our forbs. And those are sethoxydim and fluazafop. I can never say that one right. The trade name of this one's going to be Post. That's where we're going to be seeing it sold as. And those are really good to use if you have an area that maybe you have just a little bit of reed canary grass, but you have all kinds of other native plants that you don't want to kill. So going off that, there's a reed canary grass management guide, and I'll put the link there, and I'll put it in the chat. That gives you some information about how to control reed canary grass. Some of the recommendations differ based on if you have a monoculture of reed canary grass, or if you have reed canary grass in a field that's mixed with native species. The difference is going to be basically whether or not you use an herbicide like imazapyr or glyphosate that's going to kill all the plants in there, or you use a herbicide like sethoxydim or Post, which is a grass selective herbicide, which is just going to kill the grasses in the field. Or if you just spot spray plants in the field rather than spraying the entire field. Some native lookalikes to reed canary grass would be blue joint reed grass. this is what it looks like here. Seed head pretty similar looking to reed canary grass, but if you look at the leaves here, they droop more, so they don't really grow as sharp at an angle or grow upwards like reed canary grass. They're look a little flimsier and grow more and droop towards the ground. You also have rice cut grass, which is a pretty common wetland plant. It's going to be shorter, it's going to have thinner leaves, and it's going to have more of an open seed head. The last one we're going to talk about is purple loosestrife. And it was originally introduced from Eurasia in the 1800s as a landscaping plant. And the difference between it and the reed canary grass and Phragmites is that it's a forb, so it's a broadleaf plant, but it is still rhizomatous and it's a perennial. It typically grows 2 to 6 feet tall. It's pretty easy to identify. It has stems that are angled and leaves that are opposite or whorled, and it has purple flowers on these spikes. So here's some really good pictures of purple loosestrife. So you can see the purple flowers there. The top right shows you the opposite leaves and then the angled or square stems. And then that bottom right picture shows you what it can look like across the whole wetland in the summer. Similar impacts: it forms a monoculture, reduces plant diversity, can impact and reduce wildlife habitat, and it can alter the wetland function and processes about how water flows and is filtered through the wetland. Controlling it, there's a few more options. Mechanically, you can control it by hand pulling and getting the root system out. There actually is a biological control for purple loosestrife. There's a few leaf-eating beetles that have been released to control purple loosestrife, and they've actually done a pretty good job. There's I think there's been even releases in Indiana in certain places to control purple loosestrife, but even farther up north into Minnesota, there's been releases as well, and they do a pretty good job at controlling purple loosestrife. It's not something that you necessarily have the option to go buy or get, but they may be out in the environment. When it comes to chemical, again, same thing. If it's around water, you have to use a water labeled herbicide. It's going to be a foliar application. You're going to apply it on the green growing plant in the early to late summer. And then you're going to be using something like glyphosate, imazapyr, or even triclopyr, which Phil mentioned earlier for controlling wing burning bush. It can control purple loosestrife as well. And that's going to be things I can't recall off the top of my head what the water labeled variety of triclopyr is, but you just have to make sure you get the right product. So those are the three that I wanted to cover, and I'm going to provide a few more resources here in the chat box for learning more information about these species. And there's certainly more wetland invasives, but these are three pretty common ones that you'll see out in the landscape. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions, depending on how much time we have.
You still have a few minutes. Remember, we have, extra time built in already a little bit. So I do see one of the first questions in the chat was, when is the best time to burn?
For which species is there? It may differ between species. So for Phragmites, burning in the spring, in that February, March, late winter, early spring, February, March timeframe is a really good time to burn, to get rid of all the dead material, so that you can come back with an herbicide application or with even smothering, and you're not having to deal with all of that 10 to 15 feet tall standing dead material, which helps you use less herbicide that way because you're not spraying as much vegetation. If it's reed canary grass, then you're going to push that burning back into that April, May timeframe because you want it to be actively growing, and then that'll help control it and kind of hit it when it's growing.
All right, thank you. One more, is there a native form of reed canary grass?
So that's a good question, and I don't know if there's a consensus, if there is or not. I have read some articles that make the case that there was a native variety of reed canary grass, but I don't know if there's actual consensus on that. And then the other thing I read is that it's potentially been hybridized so much with the invasive reed canary grass that you can't really tell the difference if there is even a native variety of it.
If anybody else has any, you can either unmute or continue to type in the chat pod. We'll go with that for another couple minutes.
And
I'll just, my, not really a question, my experience with the Phragmites. So I've been trying to control that for several years. And it's not an easy thing to do. The stems on those can flip down and spread like 10 feet or more in a year, and each little node sprouts up a new plant. And this year with the drought, I've noticed ones sprouting up in spot, like the water level's gone down and new plants have sprouted up where they hadn't been growing in several years. So I'm not sure if those root systems can lie dormant under the water for several years. It's just
they can.
Yes. Yeah. So I was sprayed like 3 times this fall, and there's still more popping up after that. So I'll see what, maybe they get flooded out. Who knows?
Yeah, I was gonna say that in years of drought, they can actually do better because then it exposes more soil as the wetland is dry. There's still moisture in the soil, probably not enough moisture in the soil that they can exploit it, but now they're not competing with standing water. So it can help them spread even farther.